Hi, I'm Debbie Ingram. We hear a lot in political circles in Vermont these days about the lack of affordability in the state. We're told that people leave the state or they don't come in the first place because it's so unaffordable. Is that reality or perception? Join me as I host a series of interviews on affordability in Vermont as part of the larger series Under the Dome by Town Meeting TV. We'll focus on taxes, housing costs, and income, and you'll have the information you need to decide for yourself. And we are continuing our Affordability in Vermont series of Under the Dome interviews. Today I have with me Senator Jane Kitchel. James, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to see you. And Senator Kitchel has many years of service to Vermont government. You were, 35 years in the administration, and then you were 20 years in the legislature, I believe, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So, and Senator Kitchel was chair of the Appropriations Committee, which is not the committee that actually decides on the tax revenue, but the committee that decides on how the budget is built and how the money is spent. So let me first ask you, please, what were the services when you were building a budget that you particularly prioritized for Vermonters?
Well, one of the things that you have to do in building a budget, which is really more than a financial document, it's a policy document because it's setting priorities for all the various services, benefits, and functions of state government. So what we have to really do is, for me, is one of those core functions of government. And sometimes in this world, there's advocacy to add more services and do more things. And historically, one of the things that I pointed out to be aware of is that oftentimes we add new things and we continue to underfund really some of the core functions of government. Certainly last time when we did the budget, trying to shore up our judicial system, obviously there was a huge backlog. State's attorney workload was really high, and people were not getting timely justice. So one of the things that was very important for me was to really put in more resources to make that branch of government function better and serve Vermonters better. But the other thing that is really important to me, and that is don't underfund your obligations. And one of the things that I had to deal with was the underfunding of the pensions for our teachers and our state employees. And we, a number of years ago, added a health care benefit for retirees, retired teachers in this case, but we never funded it. And you can't have a benefit and no funding source. Well, the funding source was actually out of the pension fund, which we were already underfunding, which made it even worse. So several years ago, we actually put together a package to deal and set us on a path. So if whoever's around in 2038, once we pay off that debt, we will have really brought stability and ongoing funding and that kind of economic security to those employees, both teachers and state employees. So those are, in my mind, really important. And the other is don't use one-time money, which is very tempting, and start something that brings on an ongoing obligation. Otherwise, you're building really a gap. And make sure your budget's balanced based on all the things that you have. So those are kind of guiding principles that help us. And then really setting priorities because every year the requests for funding exceed revenues by, I don't know, $400, $500 million. Mm-hmm. So it's really where all of that comes together in terms of how do we get to a balanced budget? What do we have for revenues? What are our priorities? What can we do? And how to get some balance between all the competing needs.
It sounds like then a lot of tough decisions are made every year. You don't just automatically have knee-jerk fund things that every legislator brings to the table. Is that right?
That's why a lot of people don't want to be on appropriation. They would much prefer to be the I requested it, but the Appropriations Committee didn't support it. And that's where the balance comes in. And I have to say, for me personally, I spent 35 years in human services. I actually predate the creation of the Agency of Human Services. And so some of what has really, in my mind, kind of taken a back seat is what used to be our core safety net programs. And those would be the benefits we pay to families with children, usually single parent families, and the benefit to our elderly and disabled, the old, aged, blind, and disabled. And an example of that was a few years ago, there was a proposal to add some more, give some tax breaks, etc., but we hadn't done anything to increase the state has a supplement to that federal benefit, hadn't been increased in 20 years, and these are our poorest Vermonters. These are seniors or individuals who have a disability and are, in many cases, not able to work or have a robust work history. So some of my background comes into, well, who's getting it, who's not, where have we languished, and how do we make sure we have some balance?
That makes sense. And I know that a lot of states value other things, and states have to make decisions all the time. So I think a lot of Vermonters appreciate that we support some of our more vulnerable neighbors in this way. And then there are also some other more innovative programs that Vermont has come up with that other states don't have. I know there was one very recently, just before you retired, that was able to be funded. Could you tell us about that, about the child care program?
Our child care, actually, we have been talking about affordable, quality, stable child care for decades. And back 30 years ago, really, it was a woman's issue. The mother taking care of children, being in the workplace, and it was a family issue. But that really changed, and more recently, it's become really an economic issue because of our very tight labor force. Women, actually, Vermont has one of the highest participation of women in the labor force, and we need all the workers that we can get. And if there's talk about affordability, and this is something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but the cost of childcare actually was a major deterrent, or young mothers were finding that by the time they paid for infant care, they had very little benefit from working outside the home, at least for a period of time. So I would venture to say what we did with our child care bill makes Vermont, and it's still being rolled out and still yet to mature, would make Vermont one of the most attractive states in the country relative to its support of working families who have child care. And we haven't really seen the full benefit of that legislation, but in terms of affordability, the cost of child care for working families has been an enormous burden. And it's also meant, which we all do, it doesn't make any economic sense for one parent to work or perhaps stay home. And employers were saying, we need childcare, which is really changing the whole dynamic of it's a family issue or it's a mother's issue to one of how do we support people in the workforce, because we need all the workers that we can get.
And that is paid for by a payroll tax, I believe. Is that right?
It's a combination. Obviously, we had quite a bit of funding in the base budget, and then we added more because one of the things that we were finding is centers couldn't make it financially because of the level of reimbursement. They couldn't hire the staff that they needed. There was great turnover. Centers and programs were closing. And so that's why we made this investment to increase wages for people who are in early education, early child care, and to make sure programs, in fact, could develop and come in, and then we could expand our capacity, particularly for infant care. That was a real need, and finding care for infants was really an important part of that.
And I think you've had occasion over the years to actually lower Vermonters' taxes in some instances. Is that right? Can you give us a few examples?
Yes, I wrote an article that was in the paper, and I was kind of outlining some of the things that we've done to address affordability in the state. And but my conclusion was that the way in which our education spending was growing and the resulting impact on property taxes completely overshadowed where any progress had been made. And so I had identified ways that we had actually excluded more income, Social Security or military pensions, so that certain, individuals, households with incomes above 50,000 or 65,000 paid zero income tax on Social Security. So those things just don't get much attention. What gets attention are the more contentious issues, or where there might be a difference of opinion about how money could be spent. We've also done a lot to expand higher education, which is a huge expense, and the take-up of early college, which is really free, where seniors can go to college and have a first year of college absolutely free in this state. And we've done more with the Community College of Vermont. Those are all ways that we have tried to address economic pressures and make investments in our youth and in our workforce. So there are a variety of things that we've done relative to how we've property tax exclusions. About 65-70% of Vermonters actually are paying property taxes based on household income now. We call it income sensitized. In spite of that, still the tax burden is significant. And I don't think people know that, in fact, more revenues are going into the education fund than simply property taxes. But if spending grows more than those revenues grow, then the balance has to be funded through the property tax revenue stream. And where you have spending exceeding those revenue growth by huge amounts, then it has really caused the situation that is of such a concern right now. How do we deal with funding, better connection between budget decisions, spending, and how to take a very costly system and look at how it needs to be perhaps transformed or overhauled a bit for a declining enrollment.
Great. And would you say that there's somewhat of a disconnect in how we pay for education in terms of our towns approving local school budgets and then having a state education property tax to help pay for that? Could you speak to that just a little bit?
I would agree wholeheartedly there's a disconnect. And right now there's no incentive. I had one town say, gee, if we reduced our budget by $500,000, we could, but it wouldn't make any difference on our tax rate. And so there's no direct financial benefit to what you bring in for a budget. And unlike state government, where the requests have to go from the department to the governor and then to the legislature, and then ultimately we say this is the amount of money and this is the revenue box. We don't have that. So people to this day don't connect the decision to pass budgets and what that means when it all gets added together. And that's one of the that disconnect between, if I make this decision, what is the impact? Or another town might want to spend more and you end up having to help pay for that decision. And so it's really something that we've got to grapple with, because and it's very hard when you look at that individual budget. What does it all look like in totality? And that's what we're seeing. And that is why people are so concerned around the way in which that education funding works, and that disconnect between fiscal tough decisions and getting some benefit from it, or if you want to spend more, that you're not obligating every other property taxpayer necessarily, because the revenue has to be raised. We can't operate at a deficit, and that and we did have a look. Actually, the governor's come out with some proposals, but the legislature had funded a consulting firm to really take a look at what it costs, and there was an estimate that Vermont is spending over $400 million more than what would be considered adequate expenditure for quality education. And yet we know educational outcomes are declining, and how we take sort of a legacy system and how do we make, and these are choices people are going to find difficult to make. There's no question about it. But the fiscal sustainability is going to be right there, and we're experiencing it. And so that's one of the big issues that's confronting the legislature today.
Definitely, yes. I guess my final question would be, if you were to evaluate our ability to build a budget that meets the needs of Vermonters and a tax system that you feel is sustainable, how do you think we're faring in doing that?
Well, I think right now our property taxes are getting conflated and everything becomes taxes. And certainly there's no question Vermont historically has had a progressive income tax. But the income taxes are also volatile, and households with a large amount of money. So we have a small percentage of taxpayers who are paying the very large percentage of the revenues coming in. And those income sources are often very sensitive to economic downturn and so forth. But I think we have a long tradition of trying to be progressive in our income tax and making people pay. That's why, for me, when we're carving out or disregarding certain types of income, how far do you go on that? Because are you giving someone with greater income a tax break, and either you have to reduce services or someone with lesser income is going to have to pay more? It's a zero-sum game, and that's all part of, I think, why when something gets put out publicly, it sounds so nice, but people need to say, well, what does that mean? What will be the impact? What will be that collateral damage or experience or whatever that can occur? And so I encourage people to think, oh, well, that sounds good, but who's gaining, and is it coming at the cost of something else? And I'll give you an example of this year's budget. Well, it hasn't been included for a number of years, any increase for our mental health system. And to expect a system that's having to deal with increased healthcare costs and workforce challenges and so forth, providing a critical service to Vermonters, to say we're basically level funding you in this environment means you're basically, after you pay the increased health care, you have less money to pay your staff. That'll be something the legislature has had to address every year. Can we ask these community-based programs and services, whether they be FQHCs, whether there be, which are the healthcare clinics, or our mental health services, or our youth service bureaus, or whatever, to say you're providing services Vermonters and they help deal with our incarceration rates or whatever, or avoid hospitalizations. How do we expect them to do their work and do it well, and not fund them? So once again, that's where the legislature will have to evaluate the governor's proposals and say that we just are going to have to do something. We can't expect workers to not get increases, or we can't put agencies in the position where they can't hire because nobody will work for the wages they can offer. So those are some of the tough decisions that we have dealt with year in and year out.
So I'd like to ask you, what is your definition of affordability?
Well, I must say that I think that's a very ill-defined term, and we use different levels of affordability. So I would say that we can look at where we stand relative to our household income, our median income, relative to other states. I would say that our progressive income tax, and I think maybe we saw that with the Social Security benefit. If you had an income above $65,000, then you weren't going to get that exemption. That seems to be in that range.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. It is a difficult decision to make to balance revenues with expenditures, and there are many decisions involved every year. But thank you very much.
Thank you.